I never thought I'd return to a classroom. Not at 74. Not after everything that happened between those four walls. But there I was, standing in front of a lecture hall full of college students, my fingers trembling as I gripped the edge of the podium. The overhead lights were soft, but the silence was sharp. They were waiting, and for the first time in my life, I was going to speak the truth. "My name is Sharon Young," I began, voice hoarse but steady. "And I am not just a retired teacher from Mystic. I'm also someone who was hurt for years by a man I was taught to respect, a man everyone else thought was a hero." The room stayed quiet, but I saw a few brows knit together. Some of them leaned in. Good, I thought. Let them listen, because for more than 6 decades, I had lived with a story buried so deep, it had begun to rot from the inside. But today, I had finally gathered enough courage to exhume it. I was born in 1951 in the sleepy coastal town of Mystic, Connecticut, a charming place full of sailboats, lighthouses, and salt-stained history. I was the only child of Evelyn and Walter Young. My father worked long hours at the shipyard. He was a kind man, always smelled of metal and oil, and had a quiet, worn sort of love. My mother, Evelyn, stayed home dutiful, sharp-tongued, and cold in ways I didn't yet understand. As a little girl, I was bookish, timid, and obedient to a fault. I always raised my hand in class. I always kept my shoes polished. And I always followed the rules. That's what made me an easy target. It started in the 6th grade at Harborview Elementary. My teacher was Mr. Norman Graves. Everyone called him Mr. G. He was the kind of man the town trusted instantly. In church, he taught Sunday school. At school, he ran the student newspaper. He had thick black-rimmed glasses, a salt and pepper mustache, and the kind of voice that could hush a room with a single word. Parents admired him, principals applauded him, students respected him, and I adored him. At first, he called me star student. At first, it felt like praise. He'd ruffle my hair, hold my test papers up as an example, ask me to stay after class for enrichment. He said I had potential real brilliance. He'd whisper. It made my chest swell with pride. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to matter. And for a little girl desperate for attention, especially from someone so admired, it felt like being chosen. But there's a difference between being chosen and being cornered. It didn't take long for the after-school enrichment sessions to shift. He started closing the door, pulling down the blinds, sitting too close, putting his hand on my shoulder, then my back, then my thigh. I didn't know what to do. I was 11. All I knew was that something felt wrong, and yet everyone loved him. My mother told me to be grateful for the extra time. He's giving you a leg up. Sharon, she'd say with a proud smile, don't waste it. So I didn't speak. I nodded. I obeyed. And so it began. What happened next didn't unfold in one explosive moment. No, it was slower, sicker than that. It crept in like a fog, thickening over time. Every touch, every whisper, every threat, each one wrapped in a layer of manipulation, so thick I couldn't find the words to name it. He told me no one would believe me. He told me it was my fault for being special. He told me I'd ruin my parents' lives if I ever spoke. And I believed him, because what does a child know? Really, I carried that silence for years, first as a girl, then as a teenager, then as a grown woman with a teaching license of my own. I taught 3rd grade for over 3 decades, and not a single colleague ever knew. I lived a good life, a quiet one, And yet beneath the surface, that little girl never stopped screaming. But something shifted after I retired. I began writing, first in notebooks, then on old typewriters. I started telling my truth in secret at first to myself, then to others. Women from church, a therapist, a publisher. One day, a student of mine, now a social worker, read my manuscript and invited me to speak at her university, which brings me back to that lecture hall, to that podium, to those students, and to you. I'm finally ready to tell the whole story, not just for me, but for every child who was hurt behind the curtain of respectability, for every adult still carrying the weight of silence, because abuse wears many faces. Sometimes it smiles in the hallway, sometimes it holds a chalkboard, and sometimes it signs your report card with gold stars. But it doesn't get to keep the final word. I do. And now I'm ready to speak it. Growing up in Mystic, Connecticut in the late 1950s felt like something out of a postcard, at least, on the surface. Our town was tucked along the southeastern coast, surrounded by weather-beaten docks, whitewashed fences, and cobblestone streets that led down to the harbor. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where neighbors waved from porches, and where kids rode their bikes past colonial homes under the shade of towering oaks. Everything seemed neat, predictable, safe. But even as a child, I could sense that some things weren't as they appeared. I was born in the spring of 1951, just as the tulips began poking through the thawing ground. My mother, Evelyn Young, was known for her perfectly trimmed hedges and crisp white gloves at Sunday service. She carried herself with an air of pride that was both admirable and impossible to please. My father, Walter, worked at the Mystic shipyard strong, quiet, and exhausted most days. He came home smelling of iron and seawater, his shoulders stooped, his hands calloused. They loved me in their own ways, I suppose. But affection in our house wasn't warm or obvious. I never remember my mother kissing my forehead or my father brushing a strand of hair from my eyes. Praise was rare and silence was preferred. Still, I craved their approval like a thirsty plant turning toward the sun. I learned early that perfection was the only acceptable offering. Every morning, I pressed my clothes. I brushed my curls until my scalp tingled. I packed my lunch exactly the way my mother instructed: sandwich, apple slices, and a folded napkin. I walked to school with my shoes shined and my shoulders straight. I wanted to be the good girl, because good girls got noticed. And in our house, being noticed was the closest thing to being loved. Our home was a modest colonial on Willow Street, 2 stories, white with navy shutters. The wallpaper was floral, the furniture polished, the rules unspoken but strictly enforced. I was never allowed to question adults, never permitted to speak unless spoken to, and never encouraged to explore anything beyond the path laid before me. There were no sleepovers, no loud music, no dirty hands or scraped knees. Cleanliness is next to godliness, my mother would often mutter, scrubbing the sink even when it sparkled. School, for me, became a sanctuary, not because it was safe, but because it was structured. At Harborview Elementary, everything had a rhythm. I could count on bells, routines, schedules. I excelled in spelling bees, math drills, and science projects. I sat in the front row, turned in assignments early, and always raised my hand. I became known for being quiet, precise, and polite. Teachers adored me. Classmates tolerated me. I wasn't popular, but I wasn't invisible either. I lived in that delicate in-between space where you're respected, but never quite belonged. That changed when I entered 6th grade and met Mr. Norman Graves. He was the new teacher in town, a man with salt and pepper hair, a wide grin, and a reputation for innovation. He brought in old radios to dissect during science lessons, read us poetry with theatrical flair, and decorated his classroom with maps from around the world. He made school feel different, like a doorway to something greater. The girls giggled at his jokes. The boys vied for his attention. The parents praised his creativity. My mother, in particular, was enamored. Finally, a teacher who appreciates discipline, she said after meeting him at open house. And when Mr. Graves singled me out, calling me his star student, my mother's approval glowed brighter than it ever had. I basked in it, unaware of the danger it concealed. Outside of school, life in Mystic moved slowly. I spent weekends helping my mother in the garden or organizing the pantry alphabetically. My father would sometimes take me to the docks, pointing out the different boats and telling me their names. I remember one afternoon, watching a schooner disappear into the fog and asking, "Do you think she'll come back?" He looked down at me and said, "Only if the tide is kind." It struck me as strange then, sad, even. I often wondered what my father might have been like if he hadn't spent his life under the weight of my mother's sharp tongue and stricter beliefs. He rarely disagreed with her, but he also rarely laughed. I think he survived by fading into the background, something I would soon learn to do myself. Our church, St. Matthew's Episcopal, was a big part of our routine. My mother sang in the choir. I sat beside her each Sunday, hands folded, dress stiff, heart anxious. Mr. Graves was there. Too, he ran the youth Bible study and taught the Sunday school class. Seeing him outside of school made him feel even more trustworthy. He wasn't just a teacher. He was a man of God, someone our entire community revered. And so, when he asked me to stay after class, when he started giving me special books to read, when he invited me to help him grade papers after school, no one questioned it. Not my mother, not my father, not even me, because I had been taught my whole life to obey, because I believed, deep down, that pleasing others was the only way to stay safe. I didn't yet know that the most dangerous people don't always come with warnings. Sometimes they come with smiles, with praise, with promises that feel like dreams. And by the time those dreams start to curdle into nightmares, you're already trapped. The first time he touched me, it was so subtle I thought I'd imagined it. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The classroom was quiet. I had stayed behind to help Mr. Graves organize the supply cabinet, something I often did with pride. I enjoyed being helpful, and he often told me I was more mature than the other students. That day, while I was reaching for a box of colored pencils on the top shelf, he placed his hand lightly on the small of my back. I froze. It wasn't the kind of touch that belonged in a classroom, but he didn't act like anything was strange. He just kept talking about the next week's science fair, his voice smooth, his tone cheerful. I didn't know what to do, so I said nothing. I kept my arms close to my sides and focused on arranging markers by color. That's how it always began. Little things. A touch on the back. A hand brushing mine. A lingering look that made my stomach turn. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. I was a quiet child. Overly sensitive, always overthinking. Maybe I just wasn't used to attention. Maybe this was normal. But it didn't stop there. Within a few weeks, he started calling me into the classroom during lunch to catch up on extra credit. He'd say, He told me I was special, gifted, too advanced for the other children. I wanted so badly to believe that someone had finally seen me for who I was. I didn't realize then that predators don't just harm you physically, they train you emotionally first. He made me feel chosen. He told me things like, "I don't talk to any of the other girls like this." He said, "You're different, Sharon, more mature. You understand things others don't." He even joked once, "If only you were older." That one made my chest tighten, but I laughed awkwardly, uncomfortably, because I didn't know what else to do. Then came the day he locked the classroom door behind me. I was 12. I still remember the sound of the lock clicking shut. I remember the way my breath caught in my throat. He told me it was for privacy. Some of the boys get jealous. He said, "They wouldn't understand how hard you're working." He guided me to the back of the room, near his desk, where the windows were covered in old posters. It was dark in that corner, isolated, quiet. He gave me a book, To Kill a Mockingbird, and asked me to read a passage aloud. I sat on the edge of a desk, trembling, doing my best to concentrate, but his hand rested on my knee as I read. At first, it was still. Then it moved slowly, inching upward. I stopped reading. He didn't move his hand. Instead, he leaned in and whispered, "You're so smart, Sharon, so special." I felt sick, but I didn't say a word, because I was terrified, because I didn't understand what was happening, because my brain couldn't process how someone everyone admired could be doing something so wrong. When I got home that evening, I went straight to my room. My mother noticed something was off. "What's gotten into you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Nothing." I whispered, "Well, fix your face before dinner. You look like a sour peach." And that was that. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't press. In her world, appearances mattered more than feelings. Emotions were messy, unnecessary, weak, so I swallowed it. Again. The weeks that followed blurred together. His behavior escalated. He found ways to isolate me. He'd lean over me while I worked, his breath hot on my neck. He started giving me small gifts, erasers, stickers, a book of poems. He once slipped a gold locket into my desk. When I found it, I was startled. "It's a secret," he said with a wink, "just between us." That phrase, "just between us," would haunt me for decades. It became the leash he used to tether me in silence. He told me if I ever told anyone, I'd be expelled, that my parents would be humiliated, that I'd ruin his life and my own. And because I was 12 and naive and desperate not to disappoint anyone, I believed him. Worse than the fear was the confusion, the deep, soul-twisting confusion that made me question my own reality. How could someone who brought cookies to the class, who read us stories with silly voices, who helped struggling students after school, how could he be doing something so ugly I began to hate myself? Maybe I had done something to invite this. Maybe my silence meant I deserved it. Maybe I was broken. I started doing poorly in school. Not enough to raise alarms, just enough to slip under the radar. I stopped raising my hand. I sat in the back. I kept my head down. Mr. Graves didn't like that. He began calling on me more, singling me out, scolding me for not living up to my potential. At home, my mother echoed his disappointment. "You're letting him down," she said. "He's the best teacher you'll ever have." That sentence shattered me. Even in my misery, I knew no one would believe me, because abusers don't just groom children. they groom entire communities, the church, the PTA, the school board. Everyone loved him. He was Mr. Graves, the man who stayed late to tutor struggling students, the man who helped build the new playground, the man who, behind closed doors, robbed me of my safety, my innocence, and my voice. And I was just a little girl. I didn't yet know how to scream. For 3 years, I lived in a state of constant dread. Each school day began with the same ritual, me staring into the bathroom mirror, willing myself to be invisible. I'd press powder onto my pale skin until my face looked like porcelain, not because I wanted to look pretty, but because I needed a mask, a shield, something to hide the tremor behind my eyes. At school, Mr. Graves continued his campaign of control. I learned to anticipate his movements, to decipher the warning signs in his eyes. A raised eyebrow meant he was annoyed. A narrowed gaze meant I hadn't been grateful enough. I learned when to speak and when to fall silent. I perfected the art of smiling through fear. He was careful, always careful. Never anything that would leave a mark, nothing loud or obvious, just enough to make me squirm in my own skin, just enough to remind me who held the power. He continued giving me small gifts, a necklace, a set of colored pens, a scarf. Each item carried the same message: you belong to me. And I believed it, because he had shaped my world to the point where no one else even noticed I was drowning. My mother was too busy keeping up appearances, polishing the silver, organizing luncheons for the Church Women's Guild, reminding me daily that nothing matters more than reputation. If I came home quiet, she'd say I was being dramatic. If I cried, she'd roll her eyes and tell me to go splash my face. As for my father, he never saw. He was a quiet man who lived in his own shadow. He rose early, worked late, and sat in the same recliner every night watching baseball, sipping sweet tea, and pretending the silence in our house was peace. Maybe he suspected something was off. Maybe he didn't want to know. By the time I turned 15, I had stopped hoping anyone would rescue me. Instead, I started building a secret version of myself, a small, quiet ember of rebellion inside. I kept a hidden notebook under my mattress, where I'd write poems about monsters and girls who turned into stars to escape the dark. I gave those girls wings. I gave them voices. I gave them everything I didn't yet have. One afternoon in 10th grade, we had a substitute in our literature class. Mr. Graves was out sick, his first absence in years. That day felt like fresh air after a storm. The classroom felt bigger, brighter. I laughed at something a classmate said and realized it was the first time I'd laughed out loud in months. It didn't last long. The next day, he was back and he wasn't happy. He called me into his classroom after the bell rang, slammed the door. His smile was gone. "I hear you were quite the chatterbox yesterday," he said, circling my desk like a hawk. I froze. "Don't forget who keeps your secrets safe," he added, his voice low. That was the night I started cutting off pieces of myself just to feel something. I didn't know then what self-harm was. I just knew that when the pressure got too much, scratching at my arm or digging my nails into my thigh gave me a moment of clarity, a moment where my body reminded me I was still real, still alive. I carried that pain like a folded note in my pocket, hidden but always there. At 16, I applied for a summer job at the local library, just to get out of the house. My mother didn't approve. "You'll be stuck shelving dusty books all summer. What will people think?" she asked. But I insisted, and for the first time, she didn't fight me. Working at the Mystic Public Library changed something in me. It was quiet, yes, but not the suffocating quiet of home. It was the kind of quiet that invited thoughts, dreams, and questions. The head librarian, Mrs. Durham, was kind but firm. She wore her gray hair in a tight bun and read mystery novels during her lunch break. One afternoon, as I restocked a shelf, she paused beside me and said, "You always seem like you're carrying the weight of the world on your back." I didn't reply. I couldn't, but her words stuck. They were the first real acknowledgement I'd received in years. That summer, I read books about survival, about girls escaping impossible situations, about justice and courage and healing. I underlined sentences. I wrote quotes in the margins. I began to imagine a life where I wasn't afraid all the time. And then, in late August, something happened that shattered the fragile balance I'd created. My cousin Amelia came to stay with us for 2 weeks. She was my age, full of laughter and stories from her school in New York. One night, we were sitting on my bedroom floor, painting our nails, when she asked, "What's up with that teacher of yours? He gave me the creeps when we saw him at church last Sunday." I looked at her, stunned. She saw it. She saw it. She continued. He stared at me like I was a painting in a museum. Ugh, gross. My hands shook. For the first time in years, I felt a crack in the wall of silence I'd built around myself. I didn't tell her everything. I couldn't. But that night, I whispered enough for her to understand. Just enough. She didn't doubt me. She didn't blame me. She said, "You have to get out of there. You have to tell someone." Her belief in me lit a fire I hadn't felt since childhood. The next morning, while my parents were at the church bazaar, Amelia helped me write a letter, not to the school, not to my mother, but to Mrs. Durham. I don't remember the exact words, but I remember how they felt like pouring poison out of a wound. Mrs. Durham called me that night. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't question my motives. She simply said, "Thank you for telling me. I'm going to help you." It was the first time an adult had chosen me over convenience. What followed was terrifying. There were meetings, investigations, denials. Mr. Graves was placed on administrative leave. My mother was furious. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. "Do you know how this makes us look?" But I didn't care anymore, because for the first time, someone believed me. Someone was fighting for me. And that was the beginning of the end of Mr. Graves' power over my life. The fall of Mr. Graves didn't come swiftly. It came in slow, painful steps like ripping bandages from wounds that had festered far too long. After Mrs. Durham reported my letter to the school board, an official investigation was launched. I was called into an office with 2 women from Child Protective Services. They spoke gently, but I could tell they were walking on eggshells, trying to make sure I didn't shut down completely. I was 17 then, barely clinging to the last thread of childhood, yet forced to speak like an adult about things no one should ever have to explain. I told them everything. I sat on that stiff-backed chair in a room that smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, and I let my secrets spill. My voice trembled. My knees bounced. But I didn't stop. I couldn't, because once the truth was out, there was no putting it back. They listened. They took notes. They asked questions I hadn't expected, clinical questions, detailed ones, and though each one felt like another slice into old wounds, I understood they were trying to help. The next week, Mr. Graves was suspended. My mother refused to look me in the eye. "You've disgraced this family," she muttered during dinner, her voice barely above a whisper. My father didn't say a word, just stirred his peas and stared into the distance. Amelia had gone back to New York, but she called me every night. Her voice was my lifeline. "You did the right thing, Deb," she'd say. "No matter what anyone says, you saved someone, probably more than one." By the end of that month, 3 more girls came forward. 3, each one with their own version of the same nightmare. That's when everything shifted. The school board went quiet. The community grew divided. Some parents were furious, rallying behind Mr. Graves, insisting he was being framed. Others looked away when they saw me in town, as if I carried some contagious shame. But a brave few, stood beside me. Mrs. Durham, a science teacher named Mr. Boyle, even our pastor's wife, who once pulled me into a quiet hallway and pressed my hands in hers. "I'm so sorry, Sharon," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "We should have protected you." The case went to trial 6 months later. By then, I had turned 18. It was the longest year of my life. I had to testify. I sat in that cold courtroom, surrounded by lawyers in stiff suits, and told the world how my childhood had been carved apart by a man everyone claimed to love. I shook, I cried, I faltered, but I didn't back down. Mr. Graves sat just 10 feet away from me, his face unreadable. I couldn't look at him for long. Every time I did, I saw the old classroom, the locked door, the moments I'd lost. His lawyer tried to paint me as confused, as emotional, as misguided. But I wasn't that little girl anymore. When the verdict was finally read guilty on 3 counts of child endangerment and 1 count of sexual assault, I didn't cry. I exhaled, as if I'd been holding my breath for years. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. It didn't feel like enough. No sentence ever could. But it was something. It was validation. It was a signal to every little girl who'd been told to stay silent. The world can listen. If you scream loud enough, my mother never forgave me. She stopped speaking to me entirely after the sentencing. The shame she felt, the way the neighbors whispered, was too much for her to bear. I left home 2 months after the trial ended and moved in with Mrs. Durham, who offered me a room and a quiet place to heal. She was the first person who made me feel like I didn't have to earn my worth. She let me cry without asking me to explain. She gave me books, not advice, space, not pressure. In that house, surrounded by paperbacks and peace, I began to rebuild myself. It took years. There were nights I still woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, remembering the way the classroom smelled, the way the hallway echoed when I walked it alone, the feeling of his breath on my skin. But I kept going. I enrolled in community college, then transferred to a university where I studied psychology. I wanted to understand how people could be broken like that and how they could be pieced back together. By my 30s, I was working at a nonprofit that helped survivors of childhood abuse. I spoke at schools. I helped train teachers to recognize the signs no one saw in me. I told my story, not for sympathy, but for strength. So no one else would have to live in silence as long as I did. I changed my name legally to Sharon Young when I turned 21, not to hide, but to begin again. I visited my father once, after my mother passed. He was older, frailer, his hands shaking as he poured tea. He never apologized. But before I left, he looked at me and said, "I should have done something. I'm sorry I didn't. It wasn't enough." But it was something. Now, at 74, I look back and realize survival isn't just about getting through the storm. It's about finding the strength to plant something new after it passes. My life was nearly stolen by a man who pretended to care. But the truth is I survived. And not only that, I helped others survive, too. The courthouse was behind me, but the memories, they clung to me like shadows that refused to lift, especially in the quiet moments. After the verdict, I didn't return home. I couldn't. Mystic felt smaller than ever, and every familiar face carried the weight of judgment, some with quiet sympathy, others with accusing silence. Even my own mother, Evelyn, wouldn't open the door when I stopped by to collect my things. She left a single suitcase outside. No note, just my clothes, folded too neatly, as if that act could erase the years of looking away. It should have broken me. Instead, it lit a fire. Mrs. Durham, the librarian who'd saved my life twice now, offered me a room in her home. It was a modest Cape Cod-style house on the edge of town, wrapped in lavender bushes and climbing ivy, like something out of a book. She didn't hover. She didn't prod. She simply made space for my silence, for my grief, for the rebuilding, for the first few weeks. I barely left the room she gave me. I'd sit by the window and stare at the clouds drifting over the harbor, wondering how long it would take for the pain to subside. Nights were hardest. I'd jolt awake from dreams of that classroom door clicking shut behind me, heart racing, sweat-soaked, but slowly, life began to soften again. One morning, Judith Mrs. Durham slid a stack of books outside my door. At the top was the diary of Anne Frank. Beneath it, a blank journal. Start with someone else's words, she said gently through the doorway. Then add your own when you're ready. I didn't write right away, but I read. I devoured those books like they were food, because in a way, they nourished the parts of me I thought were dead. The pages told me I wasn't alone. That pain, as isolating as it felt, was shared across generations, continents, and hearts. Eventually, I began to write. At first, it was a trickle fragments, scattered thoughts. But over time, it became a flood. I poured my soul into those pages. I didn't try to make it beautiful. I made it honest. That journal became my mirror. A few months later, Judith introduced me to a local women's circle that met weekly in the basement of the Methodist Church. I was hesitant at first. The idea of sitting in a room full of strangers and talking about that made my stomach twist. But Judith didn't push. She just told me they had tea and sometimes cookies and always warm blankets in the winter. So I went. I didn't speak for the first 3 meetings. I listened. I watched women laugh through tears, pass tissues without shame, and offer hands to hold when words weren't enough. Their stories were different abusive husbands, alcoholic fathers, broken friendships, but the ache underneath was familiar. One night, a woman named Loretta looked at me across the circle. She didn't ask what had happened to me. She simply said, whatever it wasn't your fault. And I crumbled. The dam burst. I cried like a child. Ugly, shaking sobs that I'd swallowed for years. And not a single person looked away. No one told me to stop. They let me fall apart and then helped me gather the pieces. That was the turning point. I started volunteering at a crisis hotline. At first, I worried I wasn't strong enough. What could I possibly say to someone drowning when I was still learning how to swim? But it turned out I didn't need perfect words. I just needed to listen truly, listen the way Judith and Loretta had listened to me. Every call became a reminder my pain had a purpose. I eventually enrolled in community college, took classes in psychology, then creative writing. I wanted to understand people. I wanted to understand myself. I wrote papers on trauma recovery, devoured case studies, stayed late to ask professors questions. It wasn't easy balancing classes with part-time work and healing, but it was the first time in my life I felt like I was building something for me. By the time I turned 30, I was working at a nonprofit in Hartford, supporting survivors of childhood abuse. I wasn't just a case study anymore. I was an advocate, a mentor, a voice. And when I saw girls come through our doors with that same hollow look I used to carry, I would sit beside them and say, "You're safe now. I know you don't believe it yet, but one day you will." Because if I had survived Graves, if I had survived the silence, the courtroom, the shame, then maybe, just maybe, I could help someone else do the same. As the years passed, I legally changed my last name to Young, not to hide, but to choose something hopeful, something forward-facing. Sharon Young. It became more than a name. It became a promise to myself, to every child I couldn't protect, to the little girl I once was. Now, decades later, I look around and see a life rebuilt, not despite the pain, but through it. I still carry scars, but they no longer define me. They remind me that I was hurt, but also that I healed. The first time someone suggested I turn my journal into a book, I laughed out loud. I was 48, working at the shelter in Hartford, and had just given a talk to a group of high school students. Afterward, a girl with fiery red hair and trembling hands approached me. "You should write it down," she said. "Your story. It helped me more than anything else ever has." I brushed it off at first. Who was I to write a book? I wasn't a professional writer. I was just someone who had survived. But those words stuck. That night, I went home and pulled out the journals I had kept since my time living with Judith Durham. Pages yellowed with age, some tear-streaked, some furious, with ink pressed so hard it nearly tore the paper. I reread them not as a victim, but as a witness, as someone ready to face every ugly truth and honor it. The next morning, I called Daniel Carter, a friend of a friend, a soft-spoken man with a keen eye and a kind soul. He was an editor for a small publishing house in New Haven. I told him I wasn't looking to sell a bestseller. I just wanted the story to exist, to be real, to live somewhere beyond my drawers. Daniel invited me to his office with a warmth that calmed my nerves. I brought him a shoebox full of handwritten notebooks. He read for hours while I paced. When he finally looked up, he didn't ask questions. He just said, "This matters." And so we began. Over the next year, we worked together to shape the rawness of my journals into something coherent. We kept it in my voice, unfiltered, flawed, honest. We included flashbacks, courtroom reflections, and the moments of quiet grace that led to healing. I decided to call the book Shadows in the Classroom. It felt right because those shadows had once swallowed me whole, and I had fought my way into the light. The book was published in the fall of my 49th year. I didn't expect much, but I was wrong. It started slowly. A teacher in Massachusetts used it in a professional development workshop. A counselor in New York added it to her reading list. And then, a national survivors organization reached out. They wanted me to speak at their annual conference in Chicago. I stood on a stage that first night, staring out at hundreds of faces, men, women, teenagers, all with eyes that knew what pain was. My hands trembled as I stepped to the microphone, but then I remembered that little girl in Mystic, Connecticut, staring out a window wishing someone would come save her. I spoke to her, and when I finished, They stood. Tears, hugs, letters flooded in. Survivors who had never spoken their truth. Teachers who vowed to never look away again. Mothers who apologized to daughters. Daughters who forgave mothers. It was more than I had ever dared hope for. After that, the invitations didn't stop. I traveled from coast to coast, sharing my story at shelters, colleges, police departments, even churches. I trained educators, sat with lawmakers, consulted on curriculum changes. Each time I opened my mouth, I felt the fear, but I spoke anyway, because silence had almost killed me once. I wouldn't let it win again. And always, always, I carried with me the memory of Mrs. Durham, of Loretta, of Daniel, of all the hands that had helped me stand again. In my 60s, I helped launch a program called the First Light Initiative, designed to support rural youth who report abuse, ensuring they are believed, protected, and connected to therapy and mentorship. It was named for the time of day I used to dread most, the early morning hours, when shame would sink its claws in deep. Now, it stood for hope, for a beginning. And now, at 74, retired from advocacy work but still mentoring, I wake each morning with something I never thought I'd feel peace. I write letters. I still get emails from girls who read Shadows in the Classroom in high school English. Some want to tell me their stories. Others just say, "Thank you." Each message reminds me why I spoke, why I kept going, why I bled my past onto paper. Because if one person chooses to speak out, if one girl chooses to run, to scream, to fight, then every word I ever wrote was worth it. It was a quiet spring morning in Mystic. The daffodils had just begun to bloom along the picket fence, and I had just returned from my walk to the docks, the smell of salt still clinging to my coat. When I opened the mailbox, I saw it a cream-colored envelope with my name scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dear Sharon," it began. "I don't know if you'll ever read this. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away. But I need to say it before it's too late. It was from my mother. My heart seized as I read on. I know what you think of me, and you're right. I failed you. I let him near you, and I turned away when you needed me most. There is no excuse that could ever make that right." I sat down at the kitchen table, hands trembling, every breath caught in my throat. I was afraid, she continued, afraid of losing him, afraid of being alone, afraid of facing what I already knew in my bones. I told myself lies that you were exaggerating, that you'd get over it, that maybe it wasn't that bad, but I knew. God help me, I knew. I closed my eyes. "I've been sick," the letter read. "Stage 4 lung cancer. I have months, maybe less, and all I can think about is how I traded my daughter's safety for my own denial. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I see it now. All of it." There was no return address, only a postmark from a hospice facility in Tampa, Florida. For the rest of the day, I wandered through my house like a ghost. That letter reopened wounds I had long packed away in drawers and sealed with therapy and time. Yet somewhere, beneath the ache, was something quieter. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but maybe the space for it. I wrestled with the decision all night. Part of me wanted to burn the letter. Another part of me, still that little girl crying alone in her room, wanted answers. The next morning, I made the call. The nurse who answered sounded surprised but kind. "Yes," she said. "Evelyn's still with us, but she's growing weaker." 2 days later, I boarded a flight to Tampa. I didn't tell anyone, not even Judith. I needed to do this alone. The hospice room smelled of lavender and alcohol wipes. My mother lay in bed, frailer than I ever imagined her. Her hair was thin and gray, her face sunken, but her eyes, the same eyes I had inherited, looked up and widened. "Sharon," she whispered, "you came." I stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, unsure if I could take another step. Then I sat in the chair beside her, back straight, hands folded, heart armored. "I read your letter," I said. Tears slipped from her eyes. "I didn't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it. I needed to try." Silence filled the room. For years, I had fantasized about this confrontation. I had imagined screaming, accusations, dramatic exits, but none of that came. Instead, I found myself saying the only truth I had. "You broke my heart." I told her, more than Graves ever did. "You were supposed to protect me, and you didn't." She closed her eyes, as if my words physically struck her. "I was weak," she rasped, "and I will regret that until I take my last breath." "I believe you," I whispered, surprising myself. She turned to me slowly. "You do. I believe your regret is real. And maybe that's a kind of justice, living with what you allowed." I didn't hold her hand. I didn't kiss her forehead, but I stayed. For 3 hours, I let her speak. I let her weep. And when she finally fell asleep, I stood, gathered my bag, and left. It wasn't closure. Closure is a myth, but it was a step. On the flight home, I stared out the window as clouds drifted by like pages turning. I thought of that letter, how long she must have stared at the paper before writing it, how hard truth can be, even when it arrives too late. She passed away 6 weeks later. I didn't go to the funeral, but I lit a candle in her name that night and placed it on my windowsill, watching the flame flicker gently against the dark. A life lost in fear, a daughter reclaimed through fire, and somehow it was enough. In the years that followed my visit to Tampa, something inside me began to shift, not with a dramatic rush, but gradually, like a tide rising at dawn. After everything, after speaking my truth, confronting my past, and laying my mother's memory to rest, I found myself asking one quiet, persistent question: what will I leave behind? I was 70 years old when I first walked through the doors of Mystic High School, not as a student this time, but as a guest speaker. I stood in front of a room of teenagers, many of them slouched in their seats, skeptical, distracted, but I told them my story not with theatrics, but with honesty. I didn't soften the details. I didn't rush past the pain. I let them hear what it sounds like when a survivor reclaims her voice. And when I finished, something remarkable happened. They clapped. Not the polite applause of students eager to leave class, but the kind that sticks. Then the questions came. One girl asked how I found the strength to speak. Another boy, barely 16, shared that his friend had confided in him about something similar. Others stayed after class just to say thank you. That day changed me. I realized that my story was no longer mine alone. It was a bridge, one that could help others cross from silence into strength. So, I started volunteering more at schools, youth centers, even juvenile detention facilities. I met boys who had been taught that crying was weakness, and girls who had never been believed. I met teachers desperate for guidance, and counselors stretched too thin. I met young versions of myself in all of them. With the help of a few friends, I founded the Sparrow Initiative, named after the tiny bird that once comforted me outside the classroom window as a child. It began as a mentorship program for at-risk youth in New England, but it grew fast. We offered workshops on abuse prevention, healing through storytelling, and building self-worth. I brought in trauma counselors, legal advocates, writers, and survivors. I didn't just want to tell my story. I wanted to help others tell theirs. In my small office in downtown Mystic, tucked above a cafe and overlooking the harbor, I met with girls who reminded me so much of that younger Sharon, eyes darting, hands clenched in their laps, unsure if they were safe. I didn't push, I didn't prod, I simply listened, again and again. And when they were ready, I handed them a blank journal and said, "This is your beginning." Some of them went on to speak publicly, others healed quietly, a few fell and had to rise again. But they all had something I never had growing up, someone who saw them, believed them, and stayed. At 74 now, I don't move as quickly as I once did, but every step I take is steady. Every word I speak is grounded in years of walking through fire and coming out with purpose. I've mentored over 100 young women through Sparrow. I've helped pass local legislation for better child protection policies. And every Christmas, I get a pile of handwritten cards from those I've walked beside, some signed simply, "Thank you for seeing me." This legacy wasn't planned. It wasn't written in a grand vision board or journal entry. It was born of pain, but built with love. And in the end, isn't that the most powerful thing we can leave behind? There are days now quiet, golden days when I sit by my window in Mystic and watch the sunlight stretch across the water. I cradle a warm cup of tea between my hands and feel the breeze brush gently through the curtains. And in those moments of stillness, I find myself asking, how did I survive all of it? The answer isn't easy. The road was never easy. For years, I lived in fear. As a child, I was silenced. As a teen, I was forgotten. As a woman, I carried those invisible wounds like anchors around my heart. But somehow, with time, with the help of those who cared, and most of all, with my own determination, I rose. Not all at once. Some days, I took one step forward and 2 steps back, but each time I stood up, I did it with a little more strength. And eventually, the girl who once stared out a school window in terror grew into a woman who helps others walk through their own storms. If you had told little Sharon Young that one day she would speak in front of crowds, create a program that would help save lives, or sit across from other survivors and say, "You are not broken," she never would have believed you. But that's the beauty of healing. It isn't about becoming someone else. It's about finally coming home to yourself. Forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a process. I didn't forgive my mother because she deserved it. I forgave because I needed to free myself from the weight of her choices. I didn't share my story for attention. I did it so others could feel less alone. And I didn't survive because I was the strongest. I survived because I refused to give up, even when every voice in my head told me to stay silent. Now, at 74, I know this truth deeply. Pain doesn't define you. What you do with that pain, how you rise from it, how you love through it, how you shine in spite of it, that's what defines you. I lived through darkness, but I found the light. And to anyone out there, man or woman, young or old, who's still living in the shadows of their past, your story isn't over. Healing is not about forgetting what happened to you. It's about reclaiming your power. It's about realizing that what happened to you does not decide what happens next. You are not too old to heal. You are not too broken to be whole. You are not too late to begin again. I hope my story reminds you of that. If it moved you, If you saw even a piece of yourself in my journey, I ask you to do one thing. Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your truth, or even just a word of encouragement to someone who might need it. And if you believe stories like mine deserve to be heard, please subscribe to the channel. There are more voices like mine, like yours, that the world needs to hear. Together, we can build a space of honesty, healing, and hope, because no matter how dark your past may be, there is always a way forward. There is always a light to be found, and sometimes that light is you.